Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about some significant US drug legislation. And I think it's kind of important for us to think about the fact that really we haven't had drugs around all that long. Um, and, and before, and the drugs that we have had around for a while, we haven't had a whole lot of legislation around. Um, so in early America, we did not have any legislation put in place or any oversee in terms of medications that were being sold. And these were called medications or patent medicine. So there was, like in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we saw like a pretty dramatic increase of these patent medicines on available for people to purchase. A patent medicine contained a brand name, and that name usually had something to do with what the medication was supposed to be helpful for, some way to identify the product. And also on the label, if you will, they made claims and oftentimes printed the claim on the medication itself for what the drug was supposed to do. But kind of keep in mind that these drugs weren't regulated at all. There wasn't any oversee. So it was really sort of a buyer beware kind of a situation. I found a couple labels of patent medications that are sort of funny. And so just like, think about how, what drug advertisements and or drug labels look like now. And you'll note that they are quite different. So they're funny. A lot of these are pretty funny. So this one in the middle, I like here, Grove's Tasteless Chill Tonic. Can only imagine what that's all about. No cure, no pay. Then we have on the right hand side of the slide, Pratt's Healing Ointment for man and beast. They both use it, and it cures all kinds of issues from harness and saddle galls to open wounds, cuts, sores, scratches, burns. And then one of my favorites on the left, which is probably a little bit hard for you to read. It's made by a company called Standard Herbal Remedies, which is actually a company that's still around. And it's called the Complete Female Remedy. And it purifies the blood, it tones the nerves, it does all kinds of things. So these are patent medicines. A lot of them were harmless and mostly useless, but a lot of them also had potentially addictive substances. Like, for example, morphine was found in a lot of these, especially the ones that are, I would imagine the chill tonic might have had some of that in there. They put addictive substances in there to make people buy, come back, repeat customers, right? Buy more and more, right? We because we have so much regulation now, it's hard to imagine having really no regulation, right? In food and or drugs. This extends to food as well. Like, as I'm sure many of you know, I think prior to, I can't remember the year right off the top of my head, I want to say like 1919, and probably even a little bit later, Coca-Cola had a fair amount of cocaine in it as a ingredient, right? Which was probably one of the reasons why people liked it so much. So anyway, this all falls under this same kind of a heading, which is patent medicines. And the thing to remember for us is that we have virtually no regulation. I shouldn't say virtually, absolutely no regulation up to that point. So what I want to do is I want to focus on some significant drug regulation that we've seen since the 1900s to current time. So we can see that in the 1900s, that's when we started to really think about legislation to make drugs safer and more effective. And so we're going to kind of walk through the steps of how this sort of all laid out. So you can see in 1848 there was an attempt, and the first attempt was called the Drug Importation Act, but this was specifically geared towards things that were being imported. So drugs that were entering the United States needed to be inspected and analyzed for quality, purity, and fitness for medical purposes. So that was in 1948. So what kind of really spurred our first step towards significant drug legislation was a tragic event that happened in the early 1900s, 1901 to be exact, and it resulted in the death of a group of kids from St. Louis who were given diphtheria antitoxin. So they were basically given a diphtheria antitoxin that was contaminated with tetanus. So I believe the source of the antitoxin was a horse, if I remember correctly, and it was contaminated with tetanus. And so these kids were administered this antitoxin, and they all developed tetanus and died. So that showed that we needed to do something here. And so the first step was geared totally around safety. And then we moved more towards both safety and efficacy or effectiveness of drugs. So the first one that I would like you to remember, and this is not an exhaustive list, and what I would like you to take out of this is just the name and the most significant, what's the significance of the act. And so the first one that you want to know is called the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was enacted in 1906. And what the Pure Food and Drug Act really got us was just better labels. So essentially what this Pure Food and Drug Act required was that drugs had to be labeled and then also manufactured to the standards that were outlined in our official drug reference books, which are called the United States Pharmacopoeia and the National Formulary. Those two references have since been combined into one, and we'll talk about that later on. So that's what we got here. We got some better labels. The other thing that came out of the Pure Food and Drug Act was that 11 narcotic and habit-forming drugs were identified, and you had to put it on the label. So if you're going to put cocaine in the Coca-Cola, you need to put it on the label, right? So it didn't say you couldn't put these things in the patent medicine, but you had to label it if it was included. So that's, okay, but it's not that great, So it didn't say anything about the drugs being safe or effective. It's just that you had to label them. So that at least gave you the purchaser the opportunity to say, okay, I might not want morphine in my chill tonic. However, it didn't say that you couldn't put it in there. All right, so it was a step, but not great. All right, so then we're going to jump ahead. Some things happened, and I'm going to kind of show you some slides that summarize some of the other legislation, but you don't need to know that for our class. So in 1937, there was another incident, and this one involved an anti-infective agent called sulfonamide. So this is an anti-infective, and what happened here was that they were making this anti-infective solution, and they were making it so that it would be easier to take. And so they made it into an elixir. And an elixir is just essentially something that tastes good or it smells better, and it increases the ability for people to stomach it. And again, the people who are usually administered elixirs, or we don't really use elixirs anymore so much, were kids, again, because you were trying to get them to swallow something that they couldn't swallow capsules, and they didn't want to take something that tastes nasty, of course. So this sulfonamide elixir was created. Well, what they used to make it taste better was diethylene glycol, which is essentially antifreeze. I'm sure none of you have tasted antifreeze, hopefully, but it's apparently tastes kind of yummy. I guess it's sort of sweet. Cats like it. In places where it gets cold, cats will die because they'll lick the antifreeze when it drips out of the car. So apparently it's quite tasty. So they mixed this diethylene glycol with the sulfonamide to make it taste better, but of course we're not going to want to administer an antifreeze to our children. And so 107 people died with this debacle. So that spurred the next sort of step towards drug legislation. And interestingly enough, you can see that on the bottom. The only thing that they really did wrong here was they didn't say that there was alcohol. Not just, they did say that there was diethylene glycol, but they didn't say that it was alcohol. And so on the label, so that was a labeling problem. But if had they put alcohol on the label, it would have been okay under the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. So obviously we need some fine tuning here. So then comes the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or oftentimes abbreviated FFDNC. So this was the first real step towards making things actually safe, right? So this is what came out of this Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So basically what this outlined was that tests were required before petitioning the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, for approval to market a drug. So the FDA, we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but the FDA is responsible for approving and bringing drugs to market. And so basically what they said with what we got under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was that safety, they had to actually do tests and get some data to prove that these agents were safe before they went to market. So how they do that is they test them first in animals, and then they do some human clinical trials. We'll talk more about this later. So what we got out of this was the quality and the purity of origin of the drug was assured. And again, similar to what we talked about before, they had to follow the steps outlined in both the USP and the NF. So that's the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. We got some improvement in labeling as well here. And in addition to putting what's in there on the label, if something was habit forming, they had to include that in the label as well. So that's all steps in the right direction. We tell people how to take it, how much they should take, and why they shouldn't take it. A contraindication, that's a word I don't think I've used yet, pardon me. Contraindication is a reason why you would not want to give that medication to that person. For example, let's say somebody has high blood pressure. You wouldn't want to give them a stimulant, let's say, that would potentially make their blood pressure go up. So a stimulant would be contraindicated in somebody that has high blood pressure. All right, so that was the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. All right, so then we've got this 1952, we're jumping ahead to something called the Durham-Humphrey Amendment. So what we got under the Durham-Humphrey Amendment was the ability to distinguish a prescription product versus an over-the-counter agent. So basically, if something is available only by prescription, it has to contain what we call the legend. And the legend, traditionally, the legend stated, and you can see it there, caution, federal law prohibits the transfer of this drug to any person other than the patient for whom it was prescribed. That's been abbreviated now to generally just say RX only, for prescription only. And I'll show you that on some labels in a little bit. So what we got under the Durham-Humphrey Amendment was the ability to delineate prescription agents versus over-the-counter drugs, and prescription drugs had to then contain the legend. Also under the Durham-Humphrey Amendment, we got some expanded dispensing laws for prescription drugs. They started talking about calling in prescriptions and the rules around that, which we'll talk about later on. Also the rules around refills of medications. And what we know about legend drugs that are available by prescription, legend drugs are different, although they weren't in 1952, but currently they're different from controlled substances. And we'll get into the meat around that in a little bit. So the individual states control physicians' ability to prescribe non-controlled or legend drugs or regular prescription drugs. The controlled substances is a bigger deal. And the Controlled Substance Act didn't come into being until 1970. So in 1970, that's when we started to take our prescription medications and then divide them into the regular prescription drugs or legend drugs and the controlled substances. So we'll talk more about that. we had another amendment, 1962. This is called the KEFAUVER-HARRIS Drug Amendment. And this was, so what we've gotten so far is we've gotten safety and we've gotten an improvement of the labeling. We haven't talked about effectiveness. So what came out of the 62 KEFAUVER-HARRIS drug amendments was that drugs actually had to be safe and effective, which is like a no-brainer, right? It doesn't seem like you wouldn't have to do this, but we did. And this all came from a senator, KEFAUVER, who started investigating the drug industry in 1958. And the investigation was spurred by an incident around a drug called thalidomide. And thalidomide is kind of an interesting drug. So thalidomide was used to decrease morning sickness in pregnant women, if I remember correctly. So it was being marketed and administered to pregnant women. Well, it turns out a couple things. One, thalidomide is hugely teratogenic, so it caused really significant birth defects in humans. And the other thing that sucked about this was that it didn't even actually work. So it was not effective, nor was it safe. It was okay for the women, but it was definitely not safe for the fetuses. So what came out of this KEFAUVER-HARRIS amendments was that we saw improvement in safety, and the drugs actually had to be proven to be effective prior to going to market for whatever it is that you were marketing them for. So on the safety front, we started to see they wanted more animal data before they even began human testing, which seems like a pretty good idea. If they were going to give the drug to pregnant women, they wanted to test it first on pregnant animals. So I'm sure they didn't do that. And also, when they get all the data prior to going to market, the usefulness has to outweigh the dangers, which wasn't the case with the thalidomide debacle. So that was the 1962 KEFAUVER-HARRIS. So now we have safety, labeling, and efficacy. So that's where we are now. So again, that term effectiveness, right? And I feel like this is kind of obvious, but why a drug has to be effective. And the reason for this is because not any drug is completely safe. They all have inherent risk. So if they're not completely safe to begin with, and they're also not effective, then there's no point in using them, right? Drug interactions can occur. Anyway, these are all sorts of things that are kind of I don't think we need to discuss too much. But one thing that is useful to note is in that blue box down there, when they started kind of going back after this whole KEFAUVER-HARRIS amendment, going back and evaluating drugs that had come to market between 1938 and 1962, they saw that only about 40% of those 40% of the drugs that were introduced to market between 1938 and 1962 were actually ineffective. They didn't even work, right? And so those drugs got pulled from the market. So that's kind of interesting, I think. And so this was, even though it seems like a no-brainer, but it was a pretty significant piece of legislation, mostly because it allowed for them to go back and evaluate efficacy, from these drugs that had been introduced to the market prior to the safety and labeling legislation. Okay, so here, if you care, if you want to know, I got this out of a textbook that kind of runs you through some of the other significant attempts at legislation. So all we've talked about here is we've talked about the 1906. That one I want you to pay attention to. The Shirley Amendment, this was 1912. This was sort of an interesting one. And this made it so you couldn't sell drugs with false therapeutic claims. So you couldn't say like this will make you, like the chill tonic or whatever, so they couldn't say that it would do something that it wasn't going to do on the label. That was a big deal. Then we see the 1914 Harrison Narcotic Act. That's when you have to, that's when we said, okay, yeah, these potential narcotics, we want to, sort of make an attempt at control with these things. It wasn't that great of an attempt. We'll see that coming up next in 1970. Then we have the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which we talked about. Okay, so here we are moving forward. The 1970, this is where we have the Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, also known as the Controlled Substances Act, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And this set up the schedule. First gave us the opportunity to say something is potentially habit forming, dependence and or habit forming, and not. And so if something has the potential for abuse and or dependence, it's going to be a controlled substance, and it's going to be placed on the schedule, of which there's 5 levels. And then if it's not habit forming, then it would be regular prescription drug. And then in 1975, we have the 2 drug standards, the United States Pharmacopoeia and the National Formulary. They're going to be combined into one publication, and that's usually abbreviated USP-NF. Then in 1986, we saw an Anti-Drug Abuse Act, and you can kind of see sort of where we go from there. We're not going to talk about all of those. Okay, so let's talk about the over-the-counter drugs for a minute. So it's not just prescription drugs that are a problem. Over-the-counter drugs can also be a problem, and there's a bunch on the market. You can see anywhere from 100,000 to 500,000, I guess, depending on who's counting or what you're including. And of those that large number of medications, only about 200 of them, there's only about 200 active ingredients actually used. So there's some problems with over-the-counter drugs as well. One is the labeling can be kind of confusing, although there's a lot more regulation around this now than there was historically. And the other thing with over-the-counter drugs is oftentimes they're dealing with symptoms that are not necessarily traceable to a specific disease. And one of the cautions or worries is that if someone's using over-the-counter drugs to deal with symptoms and there may be a more serious thing going on that requires more serious evaluation, that they may be masking those symptoms, and they might let something go longer than they would have otherwise. That would be an argument against over-the-counter drugs if you were to make one. So some of the solutions here to sort of make over-the-counter drugs less onerous, if you will, was to define essentially 25 categories of drugs and putting each over-the-counter drug in one of those 25 categories. Also have an acceptable list of active ingredients and combinations of active ingredients, as well as including dosages, indications for use, and very comprehensive directions. So that all happened with some of that over-the-counter regulation. All right, so let's talk about this Controlled Substances Act. So this was 1970. The Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, or the Controlled Substances Act, is probably more commonly refers to this. So again, what happened with this is we have all dependence-causing drugs are placed on a schedule. Right? Not just narcotics. It was just narcotics, opium, heroin, morphine, cocaine, etc. But there's other things like barbiturates, benzodiazepines, stimulants that also are potentially dependence causing. And so those are also placed on the schedule. Right? So we'll talk a lot more about this in Unit 6. All controlled substances are prescription. So they have to contain the legend, but then there also has to be some way to identify them as a controlled substance. And the prescription writing procedure is different from controlled substances than it is with regular prescription drugs. And also the penalty, if somebody is abusing these medications and or using somebody else's controlled substance, let's say, the penalties are also more severe than if somebody was just using somebody else's legend or regular prescription drug, like an antibiotic or a birth control pill or something. So this is not just a simple prescription medication. So the Controlled Substances Act was pretty comprehensive. And basically what it did is it allowed, it opened the door for a lot of research into dependence and prevention of drug abuse. It put some resources towards treatment and rehabilitation for drug abusers. It gave the law enforcement authority a lot more strength around these types of drugs. It also did a lot to improve manufacture and distribution of these drugs. So a little bit about controlled substances. These kinds of agents, again, they're placed on the schedule because, or they're designated as controlled substances because they have the potential for abuse and or dependence. So anything that has that potential will be a controlled substance. Historically, controlled substances can be prescribed only by somebody that has a DEA number. So that's a licensed physician, a dentist, or a veterinarian. But over the years, and I think we'll see more and more changes around this in coming years, this has been extended to certified nurse midwives, nurse anesthetists, and nurse practitioners, as well as clinical nurse specialists. But any of these people would have to have a DEA number in order to write a prescription for a controlled substance. And so they have to apply for that. They're given a registration number that has to appear on every prescription. The DEA number has to be renewed every 2 years by the Department of Justice at the Drug Enforcement Administration. And the records for each controlled substance that's been prescribed, the records need to be kept for 2 years. I think I already told you that. So what else do I want to tell you about this? I think that's good for now. Okay, so we're going to come back to controlled substances in a little bit. Again, if you have any questions around that, make sure you ask me. And then these ones we're not going to talk about, but I put in some of the more recent attempts at legislation. Let's see here. I guess some of the big ones were the 1997, that Modernization Act. That one was kind of a pretty big effort in line with the drug review process. So we'll talk about this in a little bit, but it takes a long time to get drugs to the market. And so this was an attempt to sort of streamline that a little bit. In 2002, they started thinking about maybe we should, drugs for kids should maybe be tested on children, which seems like a good idea. And I guess that's the big one. Okay, so these ones we're not going to hit in our class. So what I want to do is I'm going to cut the video here and I'm going to come back in the next one with controlled substances and talk about the schedule of controlled drugs. So I'll see you in just a minute.